June 4th, 1942, 1300 hours, approximately 250 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Captain Okada stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Kaga, watching smoke rise from his flagship's forward section. 3 American bombs had struck within minutes. The first had landed near the bridge, killing him and most of his senior officers instantly. But in the final seconds before the explosion, Okada had witnessed something through his binoculars that contradicted every assumption about carrier warfare the Imperial Japanese Navy had built its Pacific strategy upon. 6 miles to the southeast, the American carrier Yorktown was maneuvering at high speed, her flight deck launching aircraft, her guns firing at incoming Japanese planes. This should have been impossible. Japanese scout reports from 2 hours earlier had confirmed multiple bomb hits on this same carrier. By every principle of naval architecture and damage control doctrine the Japanese understood, those hits should have left Yorktown crippled, burning, and sinking. Instead, she was fighting as though untouched. The mathematics of carrier warfare were about to be rewritten, not by tactical genius or technological breakthrough, but by something far more prosaic and far more devastating to Japanese strategic calculations. The Americans had developed an approach to damage control, to the systematic preservation of ships under fire, that transformed what should have been fatal wounds into temporary inconveniences. And in the crucible of Midway, Japanese commanders would witness this capability with their own eyes, understanding too late that they had been fighting the Pacific War with a critical disadvantage they had never acknowledged and could not quickly remedy. The revelation would come not from captured documents or intelligence reports, but from direct observation of American ships refusing to die when Japanese doctrine insisted they should already be sinking. This was the moment when Japanese naval officers, among the most professionally competent in the world, began to understand they were losing not just battles, but the fundamental contest of survivability that would determine which navy could sustain operations across the vast Pacific. The smoking wreckage of 4 Japanese carriers would provide the classroom, the still-fighting American ships would deliver the lesson, and the cost of that education would be measured in thousands of lives and the strategic initiative in the Pacific War. The transformation had begun months earlier, though Japanese commanders would not recognize its significance until Midway forced the comparison. On May 8, 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, Yorktown had absorbed damage that by Japanese standards should have required months of repair work in a major naval shipyard. 3 Japanese bombs had struck the carrier during attacks by aircraft from the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. The first bomb had penetrated the flight deck near the island superstructure, exploding in the passageways and compartments surrounding the ship's smokestack uptakes. The blast killed or wounded 66 men, started multiple fires in the ship's interior spaces, and filled several decks with smoke and toxic fumes from burning insulation and paint. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The second bomb struck further aft, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the ship's interior, causing additional casualties and fires. The third bomb hit near the ship's centerline, causing structural damage and starting yet another fire in the ship's aviation gasoline storage areas, the most dangerous location possible for uncontrolled fire on an aircraft carrier. By the time the Japanese attack ended at approximately 1100 hours local time, Yorktown was burning in multiple locations, had lost several fire mains due to shock damage from near misses, was trailing an oil slick from ruptured fuel tanks, and had suffered damage to her radar and communication systems that reduced her ability to coordinate defensive operations. Japanese aviators returning to Shokaku and Zuikaku reported the American carrier heavily damaged and likely sinking. These reports, made by experienced and reliable pilots who had observed their bomb impacts and the resulting fires, followed standard Japanese assessment procedures. A carrier struck by 3 bombs, burning in multiple locations, with visible structural damage, would by Japanese understanding be effectively out of action for weeks if not permanently lost. The pilots had every reason to believe their reports were accurate. They had been trained to the highest standards of any naval aviation force in the world. They understood carrier construction and vulnerability. They had made their assessments based on years of training and recent combat experience. They were wrong. What the Japanese pilots could not observe from their aircraft, and what Japanese damage control doctrine had never adequately addressed, was the systematic response taking place inside Yorktown, even as the bombs were still falling. The carrier's damage control organization, built on principles developed by the United States Navy over more than 2 decades of study and refinement, had activated the moment the first bomb struck. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich, the ship's damage control officer, held overall responsibility for coordinating all damage control efforts aboard the 25,000-ton carrier. Unlike Japanese carriers, where damage control responsibility was divided between the chief engineering officer for spaces below the waterline and the officer of the deck for topside damage, Aldrich commanded a unified damage control organization with clear lines of authority and communication that extended throughout the ship. 6 damage control parties, each assigned to a specific zone of the ship, immediately began fighting fires, shoring up damaged structures, and restoring essential systems. The parties were permanently organized teams whose members trained together constantly, practicing damage control procedures until responses became automatic. Each party included specialists in firefighting, carpentry, welding, electrical systems, and pipe fitting. They had the authority to act immediately without waiting for orders from the bridge. They knew their assigned spaces intimately, having drilled there repeatedly during peacetime exercises and the ship's shakedown period. They had equipment pre-positioned throughout their zones, including portable pumps, firefighting foam, patching materials, spare electrical cables, and emergency lighting. The innovation that saved Yorktown at Coral Sea, and would save her again at Midway, involved the ship's aviation gasoline system. Machinist John Myers, assigned to damage control responsibilities in the engineering spaces, had developed a procedure for using carbon dioxide to purge gasoline lines and blanket fuel tanks when battle damage threatened to create catastrophic fuel fires. Aviation gasoline, the lifeblood of carrier operations, was also the carrier's greatest vulnerability. The highly volatile fuel could ignite from sparks, hot metal fragments, or even static electricity. Once ignited, gasoline fires burned with extreme intensity, generating temperatures that could melt steel and spread rapidly through ventilation systems and fuel lines. Japanese carriers had experienced this vulnerability repeatedly in peacetime accidents and would experience it catastrophically at Midway. American carriers, through Myers' innovation and subsequent fleet-wide adoption of carbon dioxide purging systems, had largely eliminated gasoline fires as a fatal threat. When the bomb struck near Yorktown's aviation gasoline storage at Coral Sea, damage control parties immediately began flooding the fuel lines and tanks with carbon dioxide, displacing oxygen and making combustion impossible. The procedure worked exactly as designed. While fires burned in other parts of the ship from burning equipment and materials, no gasoline fires developed despite multiple bomb hits in areas containing fuel lines and storage tanks. By 1400 hours on May 8, less than 3 hours after the Japanese attack, Yorktown's damage control parties had extinguished all fires, restored primary fire mains, and patched the flight deck sufficiently to allow limited air operations. The carrier could make 24 knots despite her damage. Her radar and communications were functioning. She could launch and recover aircraft. By any reasonable standard, she remained an effective combat unit. She withdrew from the Coral Sea not because she was too damaged to fight, but because Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17, had correctly assessed that continuing operations with a damaged carrier against a still powerful Japanese force would risk losing the ship to additional attacks. The voyage to Pearl Harbor took 18 days. During that time, Yorktown's crew continued damage control and repair work, patching the flight deck so thoroughly that when the carrier entered Pearl Harbor on May 27th, observers could barely identify where the bombs had struck. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who had been aboard during the battle, estimated repairs would require 90 days. The estimate was reasonable based on the extent of the damage and normal peacetime repair procedures. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, did not have 90 days. Intelligence officers, having broken Japanese naval codes, had determined that the Imperial Japanese Navy planned a major operation against Midway Atoll for early June. Nimitz needed every available carrier to counter this threat. On May 28th, Yorktown entered Dry Dock No. 1 at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. Admiral Nimitz personally inspected the damage, walking through the dry dock, while water still covered the carrier's lower hull, examining the burst seams, ruptured plates, and twisted frames that testified to the violence the ship had absorbed. He turned to the yard's hull repair expert, Lieutenant Commander H.J. Pingstag, and delivered an order that seemed impossible. "We must have this ship back in 3 days." Pingstag, after a long silence, responded simply, "Yes, sir." What followed was one of the most remarkable repair efforts in naval history. 1,400 shipyard workers labored around the clock in 3 shifts. The Hawaiian Electric Company arranged rolling blackouts across Honolulu to provide power for the repair work. Welding equipment operated continuously, the flashes visible from shore. Cranes lifted replacement equipment and materials aboard. Work parties cut away damaged structures and welded in replacement plates. Instead of individually repairing each burst seam and damaged frame, workers welded an enormous steel patch over the entire damaged section of the hull, a crude but effective solution that would hold for the upcoming battle, even if it would require more extensive work later. By the morning of May 30th, 72 hours after entering the dry dock, Yorktown was sufficiently repaired to return to combat operations. Shipyard workers were still aboard when the carrier departed Pearl Harbor, continuing their work as the ship steamed toward the rendezvous point designated Point Luck, where Task Force 17 would join Task Forces 16 and 17 for the defense of Midway. The carrier was not fully repaired, she was not restored to pre-battle condition, but she was operational, capable of launching and recovering aircraft, capable of high-speed maneuvering, capable of fighting. By Japanese standards, this was incomprehensible. A carrier that had been burning and damaged sufficiently to require withdrawal from combat on May 8th, was ready for another major battle on June 4th, less than 4 weeks later. The Japanese, meanwhile, approached Midway with a carrier force that had never tasted defeat. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai, the carrier striking force, flying his flag from the carrier Akagi. With him sailed 3 other fleet carriers, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These 4 carriers, each with highly trained air groups and experienced crews, had executed the attack on Pearl Harbor, had dominated the Indian Ocean, had swept Allied naval forces from Southeast Asian waters. They had sunk the British carrier Hermes, had damaged the British battleships, Warspite and Royal Sovereign, had demonstrated Japanese carrier aviation's technical and tactical superiority over all opposition. They were approaching Midway with justified confidence in their capabilities and their doctrine. That doctrine, developed through years of study and war games at the Japanese Naval War College, emphasized offensive action above all other considerations. Japanese carriers were designed as strike weapons, optimized for launching powerful airstrikes against enemy forces before those forces could strike back. Speed, aircraft capacity, and offensive capability took priority over defensive resilience. The carriers could generate enormous striking power from their air groups. What they could not do well was absorb damage and continue fighting. This limitation was understood and accepted. Japanese naval strategy assumed that properly executed offensive operations would destroy enemy forces before they could inflict significant damage on Japanese ships. The carrier that struck first, struck hardest, and destroyed the enemy's ability to counterattack would win carrier battles regardless of defensive capabilities. This offensive-minded doctrine had worked perfectly for 6 months. It would fail catastrophically at Midway, and the failure would reveal to Japanese commanders a fundamental weakness in their approach to naval warfare that they had neither anticipated nor prepared to address. The weakness was not tactical. Japanese tactical doctrine for carrier operations was sophisticated and effective. The weakness was not in ship design, though Japanese carriers did have vulnerabilities. The weakness was in the systematic approach to preserving combat capability after suffering battle damage. It was in damage control, the unglamorous but essential work of fighting fires, controlling flooding, restoring power and propulsion, and keeping damaged ships fighting. The Americans had made damage control a primary focus of naval training and ship design. Every sailor aboard a United States Navy ship received basic damage control training. Specialized damage control ratings existed for sailors who would make damage control their primary duty. Officers studied damage control as thoroughly as they studied gunnery or navigation. Ship designs incorporated features specifically intended to improve survivability, including extensive subdivision to limit flooding, redundant systems for critical functions, and accessibility for damage control parties to reach damaged spaces quickly. The U.S. Navy had studied German damage control procedures from World War I, when German ships at the Battle of Jutland had survived damage that would have sunk many British ships. American naval constructors had adopted German principles of extensive compartmentation and redundancy, then expanded upon them through the interwar period. The Japanese had made different choices. Damage control aboard Japanese warships was divided between deck and engineering departments, with no single officer responsible for coordinating all damage control efforts. Damage control parties were not permanently organized teams, but rather were formed from sailors who had other primary duties and would only take on damage control responsibilities when needed. Training was less extensive, equipment was less abundant. The philosophy emphasized preventing damage through offensive action rather than surviving damage through defensive preparation. These choices were not irrational. They reflected different strategic assumptions and different resource allocation priorities. They would prove fatal at Midway. The battle began at dawn on June 4th, when Japanese aircraft struck Midway's airfield. The attack damaged installations and destroyed several aircraft, but did not eliminate Midway's ability to launch strikes against the Japanese fleet. This partial success created a problem for Admiral Nagumo. He needed to launch a second strike against Midway to fully suppress the island's defenses before the invasion force arrived. But his doctrine required keeping a reserve strike force armed and ready in case American carriers appeared. For several hours, Nagumo's staff debated this dilemma, while American aircraft from Midway attacked the Japanese carriers without success. Multiple waves of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and high-level bombers struck at the Japanese fleet, all achieving nothing except to force the Japanese carriers to maneuver violently to avoid torpedoes and bombs. At 7:15, Nagumo made his decision. The reserve strike force, which had been armed with torpedoes for attacking ships, would be rearmed with bombs for attacking Midway's airfield. Throughout the Japanese carriers, aviation ordnancemen began the laborious process of unloading torpedoes from aircraft and replacing them with bombs. Torpedoes were lowered to magazines. Bombs were brought up from storage. The work proceeded in the carrier's hangar decks, with aircraft tightly parked, ordnance lying on the deck awaiting installation, fuel lines connected for refueling operations, and hundreds of men working in cramped conditions. This was standard procedure. This was how carrier operations were conducted. This was how the Imperial Japanese Navy had operated for months without incident. Then, at 7:45, Nagumo received word that a Japanese scout plane had sighted American ships to the northeast. The report was vague about the composition of the force, but subsequent reports confirmed the presence of at least one American carrier. Everything changed in that moment. The partial rearming of the reserve strike force became a critical vulnerability. Aircraft were configured wrong for the mission they would now need to fly. Ordnance was scattered across hangar decks, fuel lines were connected and full of volatile aviation gasoline. The carriers needed to recover their Midway strike force, which was returning low on fuel and ammunition. They needed to launch defending fighters to protect against American carrier aircraft that were certainly coming. They needed to complete rearming the reserve strike force with the correct weapons for attacking ships. They needed time, and time was the one thing American carrier doctrine was designed to deny them. At approximately 9:30, the first American torpedo bombers from the carrier Hornet appeared on the horizon. 15 Douglas TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, attacked without fighter escort, without dive bomber support, and without coordination with other American squadrons. Japanese Zero fighters swarmed them. Anti-aircraft fire from the carriers and their escorts filled the sky with bursting shells and tracer rounds. All 15 torpedo bombers were shot down. Every one. Not a single torpedo hit. It was a massacre that accomplished nothing tactically except to pull Japanese fighters down to sea level, chasing torpedo planes, to force the carriers to maneuver violently to avoid torpedoes, and to disrupt the precise timing required to launch the Japanese strike force. 14 more torpedo bombers from the carrier Enterprise attacked. Same result, all but 4 shot down. No hits. Then 12 torpedo bombers from Yorktown attacked. Same result again, devastation without success. Japanese fighter pilots and anti-aircraft gunners had slaughtered 41 American torpedo bombers in less than 30 minutes. By any measure of tactical performance, the Japanese defensive capabilities had worked flawlessly. The American attacks had failed completely, but the attacks had accomplished something their pilots never intended and never knew about. They had created a window. At 10:22, while Japanese fighters were still at low altitude after destroying the torpedo bombers, while Japanese carriers were in the middle of recovering aircraft and preparing to launch their strike force, while the flight decks were crowded with aircraft being spotted for takeoff, American dive bombers appeared overhead. 3 squadrons. Approximately 50 aircraft total. They had arrived at the perfect moment by accident, not by design, through a combination of navigation errors, independent decision-making, and extraordinary luck that would change the course of the Pacific War in 6 minutes. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise dive bombers. His group split into 2 squadrons targeting the carriers Kaga and Akagi. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led the Yorktown dive bombers toward Soryu. The Japanese carriers had no high-altitude fighter protection because the Zeros were all at low altitude. The anti-aircraft guns were still trained low from engaging torpedo bombers. The carrier crews were focused on launching operations. The dive bombers attacked from 17,000 feet, screaming down at nearly vertical angles, their Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft accelerating to speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour as they dove. At 10:24, bombs began striking. Kaga took multiple hits. The exact number remains uncertain, but at least 4 bombs struck the carrier in quick succession. 1 hit near the island superstructure, killing Captain Okada and most of the senior officers on the bridge. Others struck the flight deck amidships, penetrating into the hangar deck where the reserve strike force sat with ordnance scattered around, fuel lines connected, and aviation gasoline puddles on the deck from ongoing refueling operations. The bomb's explosive force was devastating, but the induced explosions from ruptured fuel lines, igniting gasoline, and detonating ordnance transformed the damage from severe to catastrophic. Akagi, the flagship, took only 1 bomb hit. A single 1,000-pound bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Richard Best, struck amidships on the flight deck, penetrating into the upper hangar deck. In the confined space of the hangar, packed with aircraft, ordnance, and fuel, that single bomb started fires that spread with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the entire hangar deck was burning. Soryu took 3 bomb hits evenly spaced along her length. 1 penetrated deep into the lower hangar deck, destroying engine uptakes and taking the carrier's propulsion offline immediately. The others started fires throughout the ship. The induced explosions began within minutes. On Kaga, the forward magazine detonated with such force that the forward elevator, weighing several tons, was blown hundreds of feet into the air, tumbling end over end before crashing back into the sea. The steel decks glowed red from the heat. Fire spread through ventilation systems, through passageways, through every space connected to the hangar deck. Men burned. Men suffocated in smoke-filled compartments. Men were killed by exploding ammunition and fuel tanks. The damage control response was immediate but ineffective. Japanese damage control parties attempted to fight fires with the equipment and training they had, but the fires had grown too large too quickly. The water pressure in fire mains was inadequate because blast damage had severed pipes throughout the ships. Foam equipment for fighting gasoline fires was insufficient in quantity and capability. The divided responsibility for damage control meant no single officer coordinated the response. The engineering officer fought fires in his spaces. The deck officer fought fires in his spaces. Communication between them was difficult through smoke and damaged systems. Neither had authority over the other. Neither had a comprehensive picture of the damage throughout the ship. On all three carriers, the fires burned out of control within 20 minutes of the bomb hits. Hundreds of men died in the first explosions. Hundreds more died fighting fires they could not control. The carriers remained afloat because none had been hit below the waterline, but they were no longer functional warships. They were burning hulks, their combat capability destroyed, their crews dying, their usefulness ended. 6 miles away, Yorktown was fighting her own battle. At approximately 1100 hours, 18 Japanese dive bombers from the carrier Hiryu, the only Japanese carrier to escape the American dive bomber attack, struck Yorktown with 3 bombs. The first hit near the island superstructure, similar to where Yorktown had been hit at Coral Sea. The blast killed many men in the vicinity and started fires in the superstructure. The second bomb struck the flight deck amidships, penetrating to the 4th deck below and exploding in the uptakes, extinguishing fires in 5 of the carrier's 9 boilers. The third bomb hit further aft, causing additional damage and fires. The immediate impact was severe. Yorktown's speed dropped from 30 knots to 6 knots within minutes as boilers went offline. Fires burned in multiple locations. Smoke filled interior spaces. The carrier developed a list as firefighting water accumulated on one side. To Japanese observers who had witnessed what 3 bomb hits did to Japanese carriers, Yorktown appeared finished. Strike reports sent back to Hiryu described the American carrier as heavily damaged and likely sinking. The assessment seemed reasonable. 3 bombs had struck. The carrier had slowed dramatically. Fires were visible. By Japanese standards, by everything the Imperial Japanese Navy understood about carrier vulnerability, Yorktown was out of action. But Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich and his damage control parties were already at work. The response was systematic, practiced, and effective. Fire parties attacked blazes with foam and water from portable pumps when main fire lines failed. Repair parties shored up damaged structures. Engineering crews worked to restore power from damaged boilers and bring offline boilers back into operation. Counter-flooding corrected the dangerous list within 40 minutes. Carbon dioxide flooded the aviation gasoline system, preventing fuel fires despite the presence of hot metal and open flames throughout the ship. By 1300 hours, less than 2 hours after the bomb hits, Yorktown was making 19 knots and recovering her air group. Her fires were extinguished except for small, isolated blazes that posed no threat to the ship. Her radar was functioning. Her guns were manned and ready. She appeared sufficiently operational that when a second Japanese strike from Hiryu arrived at 14:30, the Japanese pilots believed they were attacking a different American carrier. They could not reconcile the burning wreck they had attacked 2 hours earlier with the apparently undamaged carrier now before them. This second attack consisted of 10 torpedo bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. American fighters intercepted them, shooting down several torpedo bombers before they could launch their weapons. But enough survived to press home their attacks. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on her port side, causing massive flooding, destroying multiple fire rooms, and knocking out power throughout large sections of the ship. The carrier developed a 23-degree list. All power failed. The ship went dead in the water. This damage was severe, enough that even American damage control could not immediately overcome it. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, Yorktown's commanding officer, ordered the crew to abandon ship at approximately 1500 hours when the list continued increasing, and it appeared the carrier might capsize. But even abandoned, with her crew in the water and her list approaching dangerous angles, Yorktown refused to sink. She remained afloat through the night of June 4th, through June 5th, through June 6th. Salvage parties reboarded her on June 5th and worked to save the ship, restoring some systems and reducing the list through counter-flooding and pumping operations. Only on June 6th, when the Japanese submarine I-168 penetrated the destroyer screen and fired 4 torpedoes, striking Yorktown twice more and sinking the destroyer Hammond alongside, did Yorktown finally succumb. She rolled over and sank on the morning of June 7th, more than 60 hours after the first bomb hit her at Midway, having survived 5 bomb hits and 4 torpedo hits, having fought effectively after 3 bomb hits, and having nearly been saved even after taking 2 torpedo hits that would have sunk any Japanese carrier within minutes. The contrast was not lost on Japanese officers who survived Midway. Captain Aoki Taijiro, commanding officer of Akagi, provided detailed testimony during post-war interrogations. His carrier had been hit by 1 bomb, a single 1,000-pound bomb that struck the flight deck amidships. That single hit had started fires that could not be controlled, that spread throughout the ship, that ultimately required the carrier to be scuttled by Japanese destroyer torpedoes on the morning of June 5. Captain Aoki described the damage control response with clinical precision. Parties attempted to fight fires. Water pressure was inadequate. Foam equipment was insufficient. The fires grew faster than damage control efforts could contain them. Within 30 minutes of the bomb hit, Akagi was burning throughout her hangar deck and into spaces above and below. Within an hour, the entire ship forward of the island was engulfed. Within 2 hours, the situation was hopeless, and Captain Aoki was forced to evacuate his ship. 1 bomb. Japanese damage control doctrine, training, equipment, and organization had failed to save a fleet carrier from a single bomb hit. The Americans had taken 3 bombs, fought effectively, taken 2 torpedoes, nearly been saved, and required a submarine attack and 2 more torpedo hits to finally sink their carrier. The mathematics of survivability were brutally clear. American carriers could absorb approximately 10 times the damage that would sink a Japanese carrier. In a war of attrition across the vast Pacific, in a campaign where carriers would be the decisive weapons system, this disparity in survivability represented a strategic advantage as important as any tactical or technological capability. The implications extended beyond mere ship survival. Yorktown, even damaged and sinking, had contributed significantly to American victory at Midway. Her aircraft had crippled the carrier Soryu. Her presence had forced the Japanese to split their counterattacks between multiple targets. Her continued fighting after the first attack had demonstrated to Japanese aviators that American carriers would not obligingly sink from damage that would destroy Japanese carriers. This psychological impact was as important as the tactical contribution. It introduced uncertainty into Japanese planning. If carriers could not be relied upon to sink after sustaining what Japanese doctrine considered fatal damage, how many attacks would be required to eliminate American carrier forces? How could Japan achieve the decisive victory that its strategic situation demanded when the enemy's ships refused to stay sunk? These questions would haunt Japanese naval planning for the remainder of the war. At Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Americans lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, but even that loss came only after the carrier had contributed significantly to Japanese defeats and had survived damage that would have sunk her counterparts days earlier. The exchange ratio at Midway was 4 Japanese carriers for 1 American carrier. If that ratio held across future engagements, if American carriers proved consistently more survivable than their Japanese counterparts, the mathematical certainty of Japanese defeat became inescapable. The survivors of Midway carried these lessons back to Japan, but the lessons would not translate into systematic improvements that could match American capabilities. The fundamental problems were structural, embedded in training systems, organizational culture, and resource allocation decisions that could not be quickly changed. Japanese damage control had been adequate for peacetime operations and for combat situations where offensive action prevented enemy counterattacks from inflicting serious damage. It was catastrophically inadequate for sustained combat against an opponent who could strike back effectively, who could damage Japanese ships, and whose own ships could survive retaliatory strikes. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and who was aboard Akagi at Midway recovering from appendicitis surgery, witnessed the destruction of the carrier striking force from the ship's sick bay. His post-war writings described the psychological impact on Japanese naval officers who had believed in their tactical and technical superiority. We understood within hours that we had lost not just 4 carriers, but the strategic initiative in the Pacific. The Americans had demonstrated capabilities we had not anticipated. Their carriers proved far more difficult to sink than our intelligence assessments had indicated. Their damage control procedures were clearly superior to ours. Most troubling, their industrial capacity meant they could replace losses while we could not. The Battle of Midway occurred on June 4, 1942. By June 20th, American intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese messages, indicating that all 4 Japanese carriers engaged at Midway had been sunk. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost approximately 3,000 men, including many highly trained and irreplaceable pilots and aircrew. Japanese carrier aviation had been crippled, not just through the loss of ships, but through the loss of the experienced maintenance crews, flight deck crews, and aviation support personnel, who had made the Kido Butai the most effective carrier striking force in the world during the war's first 6 months. American losses totaled 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and approximately 300 personnel. Yorktown's survival for 3 days after initial damage had allowed most of her crew to be evacuated safely. Even the final submarine attack that sank her came after successful abandonment procedures that minimized casualties. The destroyer Hammond, sunk by the same submarine attack, went down with most of her crew rescued. The mathematics of personnel losses favored the Americans as decisively as the mathematics of ship losses. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Japanese Navy recognized immediately that damage control improvements were necessary. Within weeks of Midway, new procedures were adopted. More aircraft would be refueled and rearmed on the flight deck rather than in the vulnerable hangar deck, reducing the concentration of ordnance and fuel in confined spaces where fires could spread rapidly. The practice of draining unused fuel lines after flight operations was mandated fleet-wide, eliminating the standing fuel that had fed fires on the Midway carriers. Damage control training was increased, equipment was augmented, organizational changes were discussed. But these improvements, while valuable, could not overcome the fundamental structural problems that made Japanese damage control inferior to American practices. The divided responsibility between deck and engineering departments remained. No single officer aboard Japanese carriers had the authority and responsibility for all damage control efforts that American damage control officers possessed. Japanese damage control parties continued to be formed from personnel with other primary duties, rather than being permanently organized teams. Training, while increased, still did not match the intensity and comprehensiveness of American damage control training. Equipment improvements helped, but could not overcome the systematic advantages built into American ship design and operational procedures. The challenge of improving damage control was not simply a matter of writing new regulations or conducting more drills. It required changing institutional culture, reallocating resources, redesigning ships, and fundamentally rethinking the balance between offensive capability and defensive survivability. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built around an offensive doctrine that emphasized striking first and striking decisively. Defensive capabilities, including damage control, had been treated as secondary concerns. Changing this fundamental orientation would require acknowledging that the offensive doctrine had failed at Midway, not because it was poorly executed, but because it was incomplete. Japanese carriers at Midway had executed their offensive doctrine nearly perfectly until the moment American dive bombers appeared overhead. The tactical execution had been excellent. The doctrine itself was flawed because it provided no adequate response to the situation where the enemy struck first, or where Japanese ships sustained damage before eliminating enemy forces. American naval doctrine, by contrast, had always emphasized survivability as co-equal with offensive capability. This balance reflected American industrial capacity and strategic position. The United States Navy expected to fight outnumbered during the war's early stages, while industrial mobilization brought American production capacity fully online. Ships needed to survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. They needed to absorb damage and remain operational, because replacement hulls would take years to build, even with American industrial advantages. This defensive mindset had driven decisions about ship design, damage control organization, training priorities, and equipment allocation that collectively created the survivability advantage demonstrated at Midway. The proof of American damage control superiority would continue throughout the Pacific War in battle after battle, where American ships survived damage that would have destroyed their Japanese counterparts. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, the American carrier Enterprise was struck by 3 bombs. Damage control parties extinguished fires, repaired damaged systems, and had the carrier operational within an hour. She remained in action and recovered her aircraft despite damage that would have left a Japanese carrier burning and sinking. At the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, Enterprise was damaged again by bomb hits. Again, damage control saved the ship. Again, she continued fighting. The carrier Hornet was not so fortunate at Santa Cruz, taking multiple bomb hits, 2 torpedo hits, and 2 kamikaze strikes that finally overwhelmed even American damage control capabilities. But even Hornet remained afloat for hours after the attacks, was abandoned in relatively good order with most crew saved, and required additional Japanese torpedo hits and American scuttling attempts before finally sinking. The contrast with Japanese carriers at Midway, which had burned and sunk within hours of single bomb hits, was striking. The most dramatic demonstration of American damage control superiority would come near the war's end when the carrier Franklin survived damage that exceeded anything inflicted on the Midway carriers. On March 19, 1945, while operating off the coast of Japan, Franklin was struck by 2 Japanese bombs. The bombs penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar deck, which was packed with fully fueled and armed aircraft being prepared for launch. The resulting fires and explosions were catastrophic. Over 800 men were killed in the initial blasts. Fires swept through the ship. Ammunition cooked off in the extreme heat, sending projectiles ricocheting through passageways. Fuel fires burned with temperatures that buckled steel decks. The situation appeared hopeless. Captain Leslie Guerras, Franklin's commanding officer, refused to abandon ship. Damage control parties fought fires with every tool available. When fire mains failed, they used portable pumps. When foam ran out, they used seawater. When standard equipment proved inadequate, they improvised solutions using whatever materials were at hand. The cruiser Santa Fe came alongside to provide firefighting support and evacuate wounded, a dangerous maneuver that put both ships at risk but proved essential to Franklin's survival. For hours, the battle to save Franklin continued while the carrier drifted without power, burning, racked by explosions, seemingly doomed. But Franklin did not sink. Damage control parties gradually gained control of the fires. Engineering crews restored power to critical systems. The carrier regained propulsion and began moving under her own power. She survived the day of March 19th. She survived March 20th. She survived the long voyage across the Pacific to Pearl Harbor and then to the Brooklyn Navy Yard where she would be repaired. Franklin suffered over 724 killed and 265 wounded, making her the most heavily damaged carrier to survive World War II. She had absorbed punishment that would have sunk any Japanese carrier within minutes. She had been saved by the systematic application of damage control procedures, by trained personnel who knew their jobs, by equipment designed and positioned for survivability, and by a command structure that gave damage control officers the authority and resources to fight for their ship. Japanese carriers never developed comparable survivability. The carrier Taiho, commissioned in March 1944 and representing the most advanced Japanese carrier design, sank on June 19, 1944, from a single submarine torpedo hit. The torpedo from the American submarine Albacore struck Taiho on the starboard side, rupturing aviation fuel tanks and causing gasoline vapor to spread through the ship's ventilation system. Japanese damage control procedures called for closing off spaces surrounding fuel tanks to contain fires, which was done promptly and effectively. The fire itself was extinguished quickly according to survivors, but the vapor continued spreading through ventilation systems, creating an explosive atmosphere throughout large sections of the ship. An inexperienced damage control officer made a fatal decision, ordering ventilation systems turned on to disperse the vapor. The decision seemed logical. The vapor needed to be removed from the ship. Ventilation systems were designed to move air. But turning on the ventilation systems spread gasoline vapor throughout the ship more rapidly and efficiently than natural dispersion would have. Hours after the initial torpedo hit, with the ship seemingly under control and operating normally, a massive vapor explosion ripped through Taiho's interior. The armored flight deck, which had been designed to protect the ship from bomb damage, trapped the explosive force inside the hull. The explosion devastated the carrier's interior structure. Secondary explosions followed, as the initial blast ruptured fuel lines and ignited additional fires. Within minutes, Taiho transformed from an apparently undamaged carrier to a burning wreck. She sank rapidly, taking down her admiral's staff and over 1,600 crewmen. A single torpedo hit, followed by a damage control error that American training procedures would have prevented, had destroyed Japan's newest and most survivable carrier. American carriers had absorbed multiple torpedo hits and remained afloat. Franklin had survived bombs that created fires and explosions throughout her hangar deck. Yorktown had remained afloat for days after multiple bomb and torpedo hits. The disparity in survivability could not be explained by ship design alone. Though design mattered, it could not be explained by luck or chance. Though fortune certainly played a role in every battle, the fundamental explanation was systematic investment in damage control as a core naval capability, investment that the United States Navy had made and the Imperial Japanese Navy had not. The organizational differences between American and Japanese damage control were documented extensively in post-war technical studies conducted by American investigators, examining surviving Japanese ships and interviewing Japanese naval personnel. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which examined Japanese war production and military effectiveness, devoted significant attention to damage control capabilities. The findings confirmed what battle experience had demonstrated. Japanese damage control was hampered by divided responsibility, inadequate training, insufficient equipment, and organizational structures that prevented effective coordination during emergencies. On American ships, the assistant engineering officer typically served as damage control officer, with responsibility for all damage control efforts throughout the ship. This officer trained full-time on damage control, maintained all damage control equipment, oversaw damage control drills, and had clear authority during combat to coordinate all parties fighting for the ship's survival. On Japanese ships, the chief engineering officer was responsible for damage control in engineering spaces below the waterline, while the officer of the deck was responsible for topside damage control. Neither officer had responsibility for the entire ship. Neither had damage control as a primary duty. Communication and coordination between them was difficult during combat, when damage might sever communications systems, and each officer would be focused on his own spaces. American damage control parties were permanently organized teams whose members knew each other, trained together constantly, and had clearly defined responsibilities within their assigned zones. Japanese damage control parties were ad hoc groups formed during combat from personnel whose primary duties lay elsewhere. A sailor might be assigned to an anti-aircraft gun during normal operations, but would join a damage control party if his gun was knocked out or if damage control needs took priority. This system was flexible, but lacked the cohesion and practiced coordination that made American damage control parties effective. American ships were designed with damage control in mind from the earliest design stages. Extensive subdivision limited flooding. Redundant systems ensured that losing one system would not cripple the entire ship. Damage control stations were positioned throughout the ship, with equipment pre-staged for immediate use. Firefighting systems included both water and foam capabilities. Ventilation systems were designed to prevent the spread of smoke and toxic gases. Electrical systems used distributed switchboards rather than centralized control stations, ensuring that damage in one area would not black out the entire ship. Japanese ships, while sophisticated and in many ways excellently designed, prioritized offensive capability over survivability. Subdivision was less extensive to save weight for weapons and aircraft. Systems were less redundant to reduce complexity. Damage control equipment was less abundant to conserve space and resources. The design philosophy emphasized what the ship could do to the enemy, rather than what it could survive from the enemy. This philosophy had served Japan well during 6 months of nearly uninterrupted victories. It failed catastrophically once American forces could strike back effectively. The training differences were equally significant. American sailors received basic damage control training during recruit training before ever reporting to a ship. Specialized damage control schools taught advanced techniques to sailors who would serve in damage control ratings. Aboard ship, damage control drills were conducted frequently, simulating various casualty scenarios, including fires, flooding, loss of power, and combinations of multiple casualties. Officers studied damage control as part of their professional education. The entire crew understood that damage control was everyone's responsibility, not just a specialized duty for a few ratings. Japanese training, while rigorous in many respects, devoted less time and emphasis to damage control. Basic training covered damage control fundamentals, but not to the depth or intensity of American training. Specialized damage control training was less extensive. Aboard ship, drills were conducted but less frequently than on American ships. The cultural emphasis on offensive spirit and aggressive action meant that defensive capabilities like damage control received less attention and fewer resources than offensive capabilities like gunnery or aviation operations. The cumulative effect of these differences, organizational, design, training, and cultural, created the survivability gap that became apparent at Midway and remained throughout the war. American ships could absorb damage and continue fighting. Japanese ships could not. In a war of attrition, where both sides would lose ships to combat action, this survivability advantage was strategically decisive. The side whose ships survived battle damage could maintain fleet strength even while taking losses. The side whose ships sank from relatively light damage could not. Japanese industrial capacity made the survivability gap even more devastating. American shipyards built Essex-class carriers in approximately 18 months from keel laying to commissioning. 24 Essex-class carriers would be completed during World War II. Japanese shipyards required longer construction times and completed far fewer carriers during the war. American industrial capacity meant that even ships sunk could be replaced faster than equivalent Japanese construction. Combined with superior survivability that meant American ships were less likely to be sunk in the first place, the strategic mathematics became hopeless for Japan. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been reduced to a shadow force, capable of occasional operations, but no longer able to contest American naval supremacy in the Pacific. The October 1944 Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, saw Japanese forces commit nearly every operational warship in a desperate attempt to disrupt American landings in the Philippines. The Japanese achieved tactical surprise, inflicted some losses, and demonstrated that Japanese sailors and ships could still fight effectively. But the strategic outcome was never in doubt. American naval forces were simply too powerful, too numerous, and too capable of absorbing losses while continuing operations. The Japanese carrier force at Leyte Gulf consisted of the fleet carrier Zuikaku, the lone survivor of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, accompanied by 3 light carriers and a total of barely 100 aircraft. This force served as a decoy to draw American carriers away from the landing beaches, while Japanese battleships attempted to break through and attack the invasion fleet. The strategy nearly worked tactically, but failed strategically, because the American carrier forces it drew away could afford to pursue the decoy, while other American forces remained strong enough to defeat the Japanese battleship forces. The decoy carrier force, including Zuikaku, was destroyed by American carrier aircraft on October 25, 1944. Zuikaku, which had survived the Coral Sea, Midway through absence, the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and the Philippine Sea, finally succumbed to overwhelming American air attacks. Her loss marked the end of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force. Japan had begun the war with the world's most capable carrier force. By October 1944, that force had been systematically destroyed through combat attrition that Japanese industry and training pipelines could not replace. American carrier forces, meanwhile, had grown exponentially. By war's end, the United States Navy would operate more than 20 fleet carriers and dozens of escort carriers, dominating the Pacific with overwhelming naval air power. The survivability advantage demonstrated at Midway had contributed to this outcome as significantly as industrial production numbers. American carriers that survived battle damage remained in service, contributing to operations, training new personnel, and maintaining fleet strength. Japanese carriers that sank from battle damage were gone permanently, their experienced crews lost, their combat capacity eliminated. Over time, this differential in survivability compounded, creating ever wider disparity in operational capabilities. The human cost of inadequate damage control was measured in thousands of Japanese sailors who died aboard carriers that might have been saved with better damage control procedures, equipment, and training. At Midway alone, approximately 3,000 Japanese sailors died, many of them burning, or to death or drowning in flooded compartments aboard carriers that sank from damage that American damage control might have contained. On Taiho, 1,600 men died when a single torpedo hit led to a vapor explosion that better damage control procedures might have prevented. On Shokaku, sunk the same day as Taiho by 3 submarine torpedoes, 1,200 men died as the carrier burned and sank within hours. These were not inevitable casualties of war. They were preventable losses that resulted from systematic underinvestment in damage control capabilities. Japanese sailors fought as bravely and as skillfully as their American counterparts. Japanese damage control parties attacked fires with whatever equipment they had available, often at the cost of their own lives. Japanese officers made decisions based on the training and procedures they had been given. The failure was not individual but institutional, not a lack of courage but a lack of preparation, not an absence of effort but an absence of the systematic capabilities required to save badly damaged ships. American sailors died fighting to save their ships as well. Franklin lost over 700 men despite ultimately surviving. Yorktown lost over 140 men despite her damage control team's successful efforts to keep her fighting. The difference was that American damage control saved ships that Japanese damage control could not have saved, meaning that American casualties, while tragic, occurred aboard ships that continued contributing to the war effort rather than sinking uselessly. American damage control training meant that more sailors knew how to fight fires, control flooding, and restore damaged systems, improving survival rates both for ships and for crew members. American damage control equipment meant that sailors fighting for their ships had the tools needed to win those fights. The lessons of Midway regarding damage control superiority were studied extensively by the United States Navy during and after the war. The success of American damage control validated the pre-war investments in training, equipment, organization, and design that had created this capability. But the Navy also identified areas for improvement. After-action reports from every carrier engagement analyzed what had worked well and what needed improvement in damage control responses. Successful techniques were shared fleet-wide through training bulletins and tactical memoranda. Equipment deficiencies were corrected. Training was refined based on combat experience. This institutional learning process gave the United States Navy an additional advantage beyond the initial superiority in damage control capabilities. American damage control continuously improved throughout the war as lessons from combat were rapidly incorporated into training and procedures. Japanese damage control also improved based on combat experience, but the improvements were constrained by fundamental organizational and resource limitations that could not be quickly overcome. American damage control in 1945 was significantly more effective than in 1942. Japanese damage control in 1945, while better than in 1942, never approached American capabilities. The strategic implications extended beyond World War II. The United States Navy's emphasis on damage control became a permanent feature of American naval culture and continues to the present day. Every American sailor receives damage control training. Every naval officer studies damage control. Modern American warships are designed with survivability as a primary consideration, incorporating lessons learned from World War II and subsequent conflicts. The institutional knowledge built during World War II about how to save badly damaged ships has been preserved and enhanced through decades of continuous training and study. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist in 1945, with Japan's surrender. The modern Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, created after the war, adopted many American naval practices, including comprehensive damage control training and organization. The lessons of Midway, Coral Sea, and the other carrier battles where damage control proved decisive have been thoroughly learned by every modern navy that operates large warships. But the United States Navy's advantage in this crucial capability originated in the pre-war decisions and investments that created superior damage control systems, and that advantage proved strategically decisive in the Pacific War. The story of damage control at Midway is less dramatic than the stories of dive bomber attacks or torpedo squadrons sacrificing themselves against overwhelming opposition. There are no aerial dogfights in damage control narratives, no decisive tactical maneuvers, no moments of individual heroism that changed battle outcomes. Damage control is unglamorous work, conducted below decks by sailors fighting fires, controlling floods, and restoring systems, while bombs and torpedoes strike their ships. But this unglamorous work determined which ships survived battles, which carriers remained operational, which naval forces could continue fighting after sustaining damage. At Midway, Japanese commanders witnessed American carriers absorbing damage that should have been fatal by every principle they understood. They watched Yorktown take 3 bomb hits, fight effectively, take 2 torpedo hits, and survive for days before finally sinking only after additional submarine torpedo strikes. They watched their own carriers burn and sink from single bomb hits that started fires which could not be controlled. The comparison was unavoidable, and the implications were devastating. American ships were systematically more survivable than Japanese ships. In a war of attrition, this survivability advantage was as important as industrial capacity, technological superiority, or tactical excellence. The revelation came not from captured documents but from direct observation of battle outcomes. Japanese commanders needed no American damage control manuals to understand that American ships survived damage that would sink Japanese ships. The evidence was visible in the smoking wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, compared to the still-fighting Yorktown. The lesson was written in the casualty lists, in the ship loss reports, in the strategic assessments that followed Midway. American damage control superiority was a fact demonstrated repeatedly throughout the Pacific War, a systematic advantage that contributed as significantly to final victory as any weapon system or tactical innovation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.